Please share where you're watching from and consider subscribing to the channel. Pike National Forest, late 80s. We'd been out 3 days and felt it in the knees, the shoulders, the way coffee started tasting like a medical necessity. 6 of us, sunburnt and loud when the sun was up, quiet as church mice when it sank. We picked a ravine to camp in because it looked cupped, sheltered, walls shouldering off the wind, cottonwoods stitched along a dry wash like green thread. The sky above us had that western clarity that makes stars feel close enough to warm your hands on. We made dinner, we told the same jokes we always told, and one by one, men slid into nylon cocoons and let the dark take them. Sometime past midnight, with the cold settled into the ground like old debt, I woke to a familiar pressure in the bladder and the gentle terror of leaving warmth. I wriggled free, groped for the zipper, and eased it down so slowly the teeth barely complained. The night air hit my face like a wet hand. I had one knee out of the tent when I saw them. Bare feet. Not my own. Not anyone's I'd want belonging to a living thing out in the cold. They were inches from the flap, planted in the powdery sand with the confidence of furniture. Pale in the moonlight, blotched with age in irregular islands, the nails thick and yellowed like old horn. Veins stood on the top like blue map lines. The skin had that thin, bruised translucence that only happens when the years have pulled everything taut and tender. On the right one, just above the ankle bone, a hard knob of swelling rose like a small hill beneath the skin. They were perfectly still. That was the worst of it. No shift of weight, no twitch against the cold earth. For a second I didn't breathe. Then I let a small breath escape, and the tent wall brushed my cheek, and I thought I heard another breath answer from outside, soft, shallow, patient. I didn't look up. The idea of letting my gaze travel from those ankles to whatever was balancing on them felt like stepping off a cliff. My heart began to beat in my throat. Every noise in the ravine, it had been a friendly chorus of crickets and the quiet tick of cooling metal from our stove, thinned out until there was only the hush of the dry wash and that gentle 2-count of breath that might have been mine rebounding, or might have been someone else's lungs working inches away. The tent fabric trembled once, as if brushed by a knuckle. I don't remember deciding to make noise. I remember that a shout climbed out of me raw and unhandsome. The camp woke like a struck hive. Zippers, curses, the urgent shuffle of hands searching for flashlights. The feet didn't move. They simply weren't there anymore when Tony's beam blew the dark open, when 3 other beams crisscrossed and our shadows writhed on the walls of the ravine like a puppet show. "What?" somebody barked. "What the hell, man?" "Someone was right here," I said, voice gone thin. "Barefoot. Standing right here." We fanned out, all bravado, the way men do when the world feels like it has changed shape in the dark. Flashlight cones jerked over cottonwoods, over the bent spine of a fallen log. We found prints, mine, everyone's, smeared and confused in the sand. But near the tent, where my knees had pressed twin dents into the dust, there were 2 ovals of barefoot impressions that weren't ours. You could see the spread of the toes, the fat pad of the big toe, the slight circular scar in the heel of the right one where some old injury had settled. They stood side by side, angled toward the tent flap, as if whoever owned them had been waiting for me to stick my head out like a groundhog. Tony crouched, brought his light down to the ground as if the earth might answer him. "Which foot had? You said there was something wrong with one." "The right," I said. "A lump. Hard." Tony stood up fast. The beam in his hand flicked sideways and shredded the dark. "Pack up," he said. His voice was flat, not panicked. "Final. We're moving." "Now," someone said, the kind of complaint you make when you think the adult in the room has lost the script. The air had a damp smell it hadn't had earlier, a cold mineral tang like wet stone. Somewhere down the ravine, a rock clicked against another rock as if a giant finger had tapped it. "Now," Tony said again. "Top of the hill. Don't argue." He wouldn't look at me when he said it. That was what made me hurry. The rest of us broke camp in the clumsiest version of silence. A pan clattered, a pole refused to nest, a curse died halfway out of a mouth. The ravine walls almost seemed to lean, listening. When we hoisted our packs, the straps squealed. We climbed knees high, hearts annoyed, flashlights throwing our fear up onto the earth like white wind. We kept waiting for the sound of another set of feet behind us, naked soles whispering on grit. If it came, the dry wash swallowed it. On the rise, the wind found us again, clean, ordinary, the kind that lifts sweat and makes men remember humor. We threw tents up crooked and slept badly, waking at every small sound. I dreamed of thin feet stepping neatly from rock to rock up a creek, and every time I tried to lift my light the beam dissolved like fog. Dawn was a revelation and a scolding. The east rim of the world went gold, then white, and the chill loosened its teeth. We boiled water and burned our tongues and reheated old jokes poorly. It would have been easy to let the night be just a story we tell later with a little whiskey in it. We shouldered packs again and walked back to the lip of the ravine. The floor where our tents had been was gone. Not rearranged, gone. A fresh-cut channel ran through the middle, new as a scar, banks bitten raw and crumbling. Logs we hadn't noticed were jammed nose to tail against boulders like matchsticks, bark skinned clean and bright. The cottonwoods leaned like men who'd been shoved. In places the water was still seeping away, brown and busy, carrying grit and small sticks with it. The campsite we'd chosen because it felt held was laid open, churned. You could read the violence in the pattern of debris. A night river had come down that dry wash like a rolled fist. Nobody talked for a while. We just let it in. The way the world had shifted while we argued with zippers and headlamps. When we did move, it was slow, careful, like the earth might do something else if we startled it. Farther down, where the temporary river had thrown itself wider, the sand held prints. Deer, raccoon, something doggish. And between them, for a stretch of 20 feet before the water erased everything, a set of bare human footprints pointed downstream. Right foot slightly turned. In one of them, just above where the ankle would have been, you could see the place where something hard had pressed from the inside out, warping the skin long ago. Tony crouched again, but he didn't bring his light down because he didn't need it. He touched his own ankle, absent-mindedly, through the leg of his pants. His grandfather had died a month before, worn out by a body that had done a lifetime's work. The old man had limped the last 20 years on a bone swelling that doctors shrugged at. At the funeral, the old man had patted Tony's shoulder and told him, half joke, half promise, that he'd keep an eye on the boy as long as he could. Tony finally looked at me. There was a lot in his face, but fear wasn't the biggest piece. I told you to move because I recognized it, he said softly. I didn't have time to explain. I'm a practical man. I can name the clouds that carry rain and the smell that runs ahead of a storm. I know that dry washes are liars. We all do now. If the only explanation you can stand is a nervous mind crafting ghosts out of moonlight and the memory of a funeral, then keep that one. It will do fine. If you want the other one, the one where an old man who couldn't sleep took a nightly walk he'd promised and paused outside a tent until his grandson's friend looked up, then keep that too. The sun climbed. The new channel sulked in the light. We turned away finally, because you can't stand at the edge of a thing forever. As we shouldered our packs, a light breeze came to us up the ravine, cooling and ordinary, and carried with it the faintest smell of wet leather and mothballs, the smell of old closets and church basements and the backs of grandfather's hands. I could have imagined it. I could have imagined the rest. But for years afterward, when I woke in the small hours and remembered those feet planted on cold earth, I also remembered the river's fresh cut and the way those prints went from solid to nothing as the water took them, just as a promise is kept and then kindly let go. We were the kind of friends who could spend an entire summer arguing over which movie monster had the worst dental plan and still somehow forget to pack half our food. So the fact that we didn't roll out of southern Massachusetts until the sky was already purple shouldn't surprise anyone. The plan, if you could call it that, was the same as it always had been through high school and a couple summers after. Point the car north, talk trash about each other's music, and let the White Mountains swallow us whole for a weekend. We were older in that technical way where you can buy your own gas and no one's waiting up for you, but we were still man-children with second-hand gear and grand opinions about everything. The traffic took bites out of us mile by mile. The radio faded into static as the stations thinned, and somewhere around 10 at night we pulled into the gravel parking lot that sat like a gray coin at the edge of the trees. We'd taken too long to get going, of course. None of us wanted to hike in by headlamp, and the idea of picking our way across roots and rocks with heavy packs while the forest was just a black wall wasn't appealing. So we did what we always did when the day got away from us. We became temporary parking lot goblins. We spread sleeping bags between the car and a brief strip of grass, propped the cooler under the bumper, ate cold food out of wrappers, and announced, one by one, that our backs hurt more than last year. The air had that high country chill under the warmth, like somebody had cracked a window to space. A river ran close enough to hear, but not to see, a constant low shush that made everything else feel smaller. Most of them went down fast, a tangle of zippers and muttered complaints. I wasn't tired, or I was but the kind of tired that twitches under your skin. The stars were ridiculous, too many of them to be legal, a smear of glitter dusting the sky with no streetlights to boss them around. Mike was awake, the same restless buzz in his legs, so we took our flashlights and wandered, as if it were our ritual. We followed the sound of the river through a break in the trees until a wooden footbridge appeared, narrow and no nonsense, a slat of pale boards arcing over a slice of black water. It wasn't long, maybe 20 paces, but it had that fairy tale quality bridges get at night. A threshold you don't know you're crossing until you're in the middle and the rules have changed. We clicked our lights off because the moon was enough. It sat low, swollen and bright, dressed in thin mist so it looked like a coin pressed under glass. The boards murmured under our feet in gentle complaint. We leaned on the railing, two men in the world's dumbest tuxedos, layers of mismatched fleece, and talked about nothing and everything. Movies, games, the way it felt to be temporarily parentless and directionless at once, like your life was a shopping cart rolling toward an automatic door. The river put its shoulder to the rocks below and muttered about it all. The night smelled like wet wood and that clean mineral cold you only get in mountains. Somewhere upstream, something small splashed, and then thought better of it. I don't know when the feeling started. Not in a jump scare way, not a violin screech out of nowhere. It was more like the way you notice you've been clenching your teeth, except your brain is the muscle. The longer we stood there, the more the air seemed to lean in. The river's volume went down a notch. The trees along the bank became less like trees and more like listening shapes. It was subtle enough that we both tried, at first, to ignore it, the way you ignore the sense that you left a burner on at home. Then Mike took a breath that wasn't a laugh and said, "Hey, you see that?" At the far end of the bridge, just where the last board met dirt, a tree stood on the right bank. Stood is the word for it even though it felt wrong, like it had taken its place deliberately. It shouldn't have been remarkable. The forest is a factory of silhouettes at night. But this thing was wrong immediately. It was leafless, which would have been normal in late autumn, but this was a summer night, and everything else around us was heavy with leaves. No leaves on this one, it was all bone. The trunk was massive, the bark the kind that looks flayed rather than peeled, ribbons of pale wood exposed like tendon. The branches didn't branch so much as claw out, each limb splitting and splitting again into hooked shapes, a tangle of dark fingers against the moon-clouded sky. If you've ever thought a scarecrow looked like it was holding something behind its back, it had that quality, like it was in the middle of doing something when we caught it. The most unnerving part was the posture. Yes, I know trees don't have posture, but this one did, a slight forward cant at the upper half, so the bony crown leaned toward the bridge in a way that made your skin want to shrink. I'm not religious. Ghosts are for people with time to scare themselves. Most nights, I'd have said it was an old snag and we'd move on. But both of us went quiet, as if admitting we saw it might make it come over. "It's just a dead tree," I said, and my voice came out too even. Mike said, "Yeah," and didn't sound like he believed himself. The moon sucked a little heat out of the air right then, or maybe something else did. My breath didn't plume, not visibly, but a new cold sat in my chest like I'd swallowed a coin. The bridge creaked once, a board near the middle, the tiny sound loud enough to feel like a footstep. I had the sudden conviction that someone stood behind us in the middle of the bridge between us and the parking lot. I turned quick with the reflex you get when you think a friend has crept up to scare you. Nothing. Just the boards, the rail, and the river's back glinting where the moon laid a thumbprint. We were trying to chat again, to force normal back into place, when the air changed a second time. You know how a room feels when somebody else steps in it, even if you don't look up. The tiny difference in pressure, or static, or animal sense. It came from the direction of the tree. Not a breeze. The leaves on the other trees didn't say a word. But the dead limbs on that thing shifted, ever so slightly like knuckles cracking. I told myself it was a trick of the eye, some optical thing the moon was doing, a star slipping behind a branch, but the branches rearranged in a way that made a shape like a hand curl and then uncurl. "Okay," I said, too loud, too cheerful. "This is dumb. It's a tree." "Looks like it wants a hug," Mike said, not moving an inch closer. I don't know what I was trying to prove, and to whom. Probably the crude little committee in my head that hates being afraid. "I'm a grown man," I announced, which is a sentence that has never introduced a wise decision. "I'm not afraid of a damn tree. I'm going over there." I stepped away from the railing. The sound changed immediately. Talking on the railing had been talking in a room with a river for an air conditioner. Walking was entering a church with the floorboards addicted to gossip. I told myself to walk normally. I placed my feet like I was trying not to wake someone. The cold moved with me, a thin shawl over my shoulders. The closer I got, the more the rest of the night stepped back. The insects we'd been hearing, tiny zipper sounds in the reeds, went quiet. The water's shush turned muffled. The moonlight felt thick, as if you could press your fingers through it and leave a print. I counted my steps because I needed something human to hold on to. 1, 2, 3. A board near the middle flexed, and the sound it made was not my boot. 4. I stopped, turned, and raised my eyebrows at Mike. He was 6 or 7 paces behind me, stock still, his head tilted a fraction as if to better hear the silence. "You heard that?" I asked. He nodded. "I thought you double-stepped." I lifted my foot and put it down hard to see if I could make the same sound. The board complained, but in a different voice. I looked over the side, 2 quick glances, as if a longer look would be ruder, and saw the river heaving itself into its groove, little coils of foam snagged around a root. The water was dark enough to be its own depth. The far bank was a low shelf of dirt and shale, the room where the tree stood. Leaned, watched. Its silhouette swallowed starlight. I took another step. My mouth went dry so fast it felt like someone had sponged it out. I tried to swallow and felt my tongue stick and then unglue. There was a taste in the air I hadn't noticed before, a metallic thread under the damp, like a penny pressed against the soft of your gums when you were a kid. The feeling inside my chest changed from cold to pressure, not a hand exactly, but an intent. My heart, which had been a reasonable drum keeping a reasonable beat, went off script and started punching. It didn't feel scared, it felt summoned. That thought, summoned, walked across my brain like a spider, and I nearly laughed it away, and then didn't. I was maybe 2/3 of the way across when the tree did the smallest, worst thing. One of the high branches, one of the fingers dipped. Not in the wind. The air around us was held. It dipped as if it were acknowledging me. The shadow that made the trunk expanded for a second in a way that suggested a chest taking a breath, and then settled back. Somebody, behind me took one step. I spun so fast my shoulders hurt, flashlight in hand without remembering raising it, and in the act of turning I thought I saw movement in the lower half of the bridge, between the boards the moon couldn't reach. Not a person, but a dark shape where the wood is usually nothing. It was gone by the time I got my body pointed. The beam of my flashlight blew the scene apart into white and black. The light made everything worse, the way lights do in horror movies when they find only more corners. The handrail's grain was suddenly too detailed, its knots like watching eyes. The river's surface came alive in 1,000 bright teeth. The space between the boards was bottomless. "Hey," Mike said, which is what you say when the person you're with is about to do something you can't follow them into. "Yeah," I said, which didn't mean anything. I looked forward again, and the tree was as it had been, except that I could see now that between 2 thick roots there was a hollow. The moon nested a little light in there. I had the ridiculous impression of a mouth. I took a half step that was also a recoil. My heart went from punching to squeezed, as if the muscle had been clenched in a fist not my own. The world narrowed to a tube. The cold behind my ribs turned to ice, and I felt, this sounds like drama, I know, fingers not physically but undeniably, closing around the pump that kept me here. It wasn't pain. It was promise. The promise that if I took one more step, something would finish what it had started. I stopped. I stood with one foot forward, like a lunge I had turned into a pose, and waited for my body to make up its mind. The hand, whatever the feeling was, tightened all at once. It was like a voice I couldn't hear spoke right into my blood. "Come." "Nope," I said, the word coming out strangled and thin, and then louder, "Nope." I backed up. Not turned and ran, backed up, the way you do when a dog you don't trust is deciding whether you are food. Each board under me gave way, and then forgave me. The feeling in my chest eased by degrees. The branches relaxed by a fraction. That was the worst part of all, how it felt like it let me go. On my third backward step, something brushed the back of my jacket. I couldn't tell if it was a twig from the railing or nothing at all, but I flinched so hard my teeth clicked. I reached Mike, and then we were both retreating, not quite looking away from the thing at the end of the bridge. When our boots hit gravel, we turned, and we didn't stop moving until the car was a shape we could hide behind. We didn't tell the others right away. Everyone was asleep, except for one person who lifted his head and squinted, and then decided we weren't worth waking for. We lay in our sleeping bags and pretended to each other, in the darkness, that it had been a trick of the light, and when that didn't soothe anything, we pretended we were too tired to care. The river ran. The car ticked as it cooled. At some point, this may be my brain embroidering, I heard a tiny tap on the roof of the car, a sound so small it should have meant nothing, and then just once the softest scrape along the paint, like a branch tested it. I told myself it was a pine cone. I told myself a lot of things. Morning made liars out of almost everything. The sun found the tops of the trees and softened them. The parking lot became a place for coffee steam and swearing about lost socks. We ate the kind of breakfast that's mostly heating up old bread on a camp stove and calling it toast. The night receded the way night does, retreating into the dumb category where dreams live. We shouldered packs, checked straps, made a ceremony of tightening boots, and started down the path that would cross the river on that same little footbridge. We didn't say we were going to look. We just went because it was the way. Halfway across, the bridge became daytime ordinary, boards sun-warmed, rail a little sticky where sap had raised in the night. The river was honest now, brown-green, its stones visible, caddis cases like tiny husks clinging to the underside of submerged branches. Birds were back to their arguments. I slowed without meaning to, because habit is its own gravity. Mike, just ahead, froze as if someone had pressed pause. He lifted his arm and pointed at nothing. "Dude," he said, in a voice that quoted the night without acknowledging it. I looked up and saw the far end of the bridge open onto a wide, clean cut of clearing. No tree. Not a stump. Not a hole. No scuffed dirt where a hinge of root might have been yanked. It was a little shelf of pale stones and ferns, with a stand of living birches 10 feet back, white as new paper. Where the dead giant had stood in our heads was nothing but mourning. We stepped off the bridge and wandered the margin like people searching for a lost earring. We told ourselves we were just stretching our legs, and then crouched and put our palms on the ground and pressed. Maybe it was farther down, I said when it was obvious it hadn't been. We walked 50 yards, then back. Nothing like it. The trees along the bank were young and healthy. The nearest trunk thick enough to be mistaken, in a panic, for our midnight invention stood well back from the river and wore leaves like any good citizen of June. We expected to find so much as a depression, the ghost of a stump. We found damp shale, ferns, the imprint of a raccoon hand in soft mud where the bank dipped. The only marks out of the ordinary were 5 fine scratches on the bridge railing at the far end, curved lines, like someone had drawn the same bent crescent with a nail and then been bored halfway through. I ran a fingertip along them and felt nothing but a change in gloss. We didn't make eye contact for a while. The sky had the gall to be cheerful. The day smelled like pine pitch and sunscreen. I could have folded it neatly and put it away. But it stuck. It stuck all the way into the first mile and through the switchbacks, through lunch, through the long slow climb where the trail shows you the same boulder from new angles until you begin to suspect the map is teasing you. It stuck for years, if I'm honest. I don't know what we saw. I can make a stack of explanations taller than the tree we didn't find. Moonlight and expectation and human pattern making, and the way nerves will draw monsters where there are only shapes. I can tell myself the branches we saw were a composite of 2 or 3 different trees from our angle, their negative spaces arranged to look like intention. I can say our eyes were full of stars and our brains made the rest. I can say a lot. Here's what I don't say out loud, but also don't shake, that the cold moved with me like a thought someone else was having, that the branch dipped, that the hand, again not a hand, closed around my heart not as a threat but as a test, and that something decided in that second whether I belonged closer or farther away. That when we turned to go in daylight, packs snugged and poles clicking and the bridge just a bridge again, I looked back because of course I did, and for half a breath the river spit a little veil of mist into the sunlight just where the dark silhouette had been, a narrow ghost that reached out over the planks and tapered into nothing. It was gone so fast it could have been my eyes watering. But in that white shape, as brief as a held breath, I saw the outline of a crown of branches, the suggestion of fingers. It lifted like a hand you might raise in parting, when you know the person you're leaving will look back. We did not go back across that bridge after dark for the rest of the trip. We laughed about it in the mean way you laugh at yourself for flinching at thunder. We shoved the story into that part of memory you keep for embellishment around other people's fires. But sometimes a bridge is just a couple dozen boards pretending to be ground over moving water. Sometimes it's a door that forgets to close all the way. And sometimes, not often, not enough to put your life on, but enough to put a mark on it. There is a thing at the far end that leans in a little and waits to see if you'll come the rest of the way, and in daylight the only evidence it leaves is that you don't want to test it twice. We were stationed in Germany in the late 70s, the kind of family that could turn a wagon and a pop-up camper into a summer ship and set sail across borders like they were just slightly different shades of green on a map. The trip is a smear of memories now, ugly road signs with elegant names, rain hammering the canvas, so hard one night along the Loire that the ground became a moving thing, and we woke to puddles where our shoes used to be, slugs in shoes, all of them, every single one, as if they had received an invitation. But France is where the scary part lives, in a campground that had grown up around an old chateau like mushrooms around a stump. It wasn't big as castles go, not the kind you see on postcards, more a house with ambitions from a century that liked wallpaper and heavy drapes, abandoned by the time we got there. It sat in the middle of the campground with its windows filmed over, and its front doors chained in a hungry X, a sun-bleached French sign warning against trespass. Even the chain looked old, each link a dull bone color, as if it had been sucked dry. In daylight, it was satisfying in the way ruins are satisfying. You could stand on the gravel and see in at angles through the wavering glass. The windows bubbled and warped so that anything inside swam a little. You could make out a staircase rising and vanishing into shadow, a banister polished by hands that hadn't been there for decades, lengths of wallpaper listing away from plaster like shedding skin, pale flowers and stripes peeling back to reveal the wounded wall beneath. A chandelier hung over the entry like a dead starfish, some arms twisted, a few of its glass drops still clinging and greened with dust. In one room a curtain still guarded a window, a heavy thing that had once been red and now was a faded wine color. Moth nipped along the hem, the bottom edge trembling sometimes with drafts no one else seemed to feel. If you tilted your head and squinted you could see a portrait in a gilt frame hung crooked, an oval of a woman with a white throat and a dress that made my mother say good grief under her breath, but the paint had cracked into a net of fine lines so that her eyes looked like they were made of 100 tiny panes and none of them were looking the same way. We were children, my brother, my sister, and me, and dusk meant we were drawn to the chateau the way all kids are drawn to a place they are told not to go. We didn't try the doors because of the chain, and because even we knew there's a flavor of trouble that isn't fun. We peeped in windows instead. We compared notes. The chair with one leg missing, the tangle of something on the floor that turned out to be a collapsed lampshade, the ragged oval where a rug had been dragged away so long ago the dust had grown new patterns over the scar. The sun sank, and our reflections grew braver in the glass as the room's inside went dark. My father called us back with the sing-song voice he used when he wanted us to pretend to choose obedience. We ate, we bickered, we invented systems for keeping slugs out of the remaining shoes, and we crawled into the warm fabric smell of the tent. You know how a campground sounds at night, the blend of languages filtered through canvas, a zipper, a child crying for 2 seconds, and then not, someone's small radio turned low. That night had all that, plus the soft, restless weight of that house sitting in the middle of everything like a held breath. I had to pee. Of course I did. I was at that proud age where I was allowed to go alone with a flashlight, and that pride outweighed fear until I stood outside and the night made a bowl out of the air above the chateau, and the smell of damp stone reached me. The path to the bathroom went past the front of the house. Of course it did. Everything went past the front of the house, and my flip-flops made that silly slap that announces you whether you want announcing or not. Gravel whispered under my steps. A moth batted itself again and again against the blue of my flashlight beam like someone insisting on the wrong door. I tried not to look at the windows. I failed. When your parents grow up telling you ghosts aren't real and that a locked door is as good as a spell, you borrow their certainty until you can afford your own, but it never quite fits. Up close, the chateau's windows showed more of themselves. The old panes rippled like water, thick in some places, thin in others, seeded with bubbles. My beam slid over the glass and made my face appear and vanish in patches between tree reflections, my mouth always a little open like I was surprised to find myself still there. Beyond that, there was the dark. Not pure black, it was never pure black, not with the night full of small light, but a middle darkness that felt like a crowd of curtains. I kept my head down enough to be brave and got to the bathroom and did my business with the ceremony of someone performing in front of an imagined audience of house spirits, then turned around to go back, promising myself that I would not look left, not even once. Someone else was walking across the campground diagonally, a flashlight beam bobbing like a slow metronome. Their light fell across the chateau's window I had trained myself not to look at, and it made a square the size of a television right over the red curtain. The fabric glowed as if it had a heart behind it. I glanced because you do. The beam slid 1 more inch and illuminated not curtain, but what was behind it, and for the length of a blink I saw a shape so dense it seemed to be cut out of the night rather than occupying it. It filled the space behind the drape, thick from shoulder to shoulder, head tilting in a way that suggested height that didn't make sense in that room. No face, no features, just the impression of a person the way a coat on a hanger can look like a person in the corner of your eye, except that where eyes would be there were 2 paler ovals that caught the stranger's light like buttons. They blinked. I don't mean they twinkled or flickered. They closed and opened once in that deliberate slow way that belongs to something that wants you to know it is not a trick of reflection. The beam moved on, and it was gone. The curtain hung the way curtains hang, when someone has just breathed out behind them. I ran. The sensible part of my brain was trying to keep me quiet because there's nothing more obvious than a panicked child announcing their panic. But my flip-flops slapped like applause and the gravel hissed under my feet, and that was that. Behind me, something made a sound inside the house, a dry dragging, like a heavy rug being pulled across wood by tired hands. It could have been the wind, even though there was no wind. It could have been old fabric resettling. It could have been a conspiracy of mice tugging in procession at the buried threads of some Victorian carpet. I didn't test any of those theories. The tent door zipper sounded like a saw in my hands. I was in and down and taloned into my sleeping bag before my mother even sat up, and when she did, my name was a question with soft edges. "I'll tell you in the morning," I said, and I am proud to this day that I got whole words out instead of strung beads of nonsense. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay in the rich domestic smells of canvas and damp and the ghost of coffee and listened to the campground go on being a campground around me, while the house did whatever houses do when nobody is supposed to be inside them. Once, there was a little tap noise that could have been a loose shutter or a branch touching glass. Once, the curtain sound again, that breath. When dawn finally came, it came gently, gray first, and then the birds found their courage, and someone's tea kettle sang thinly 2 plots over. The world had the patience to look ordinary. In daylight, the chateau mocked me by being exactly what it had been before. The chain on the door was unbroken. The sign still said the same polite French threat. The same faded furniture slumped in the same rooms. But in the window where the red curtain hung, the hem had caught on a nail or a splinter and been lifted 1/2 inch, as if a toe had brushed it. On the inside of the wavering glass, 2 pale ovals where something, had leaned too close, had etched themselves overnight in a film of dust, like the dry memory of breath. If you lined yourself up just right, they were exactly where eyes would be. I called my mother over, and by the time she got there the sunlight had shifted, and all she saw was my face doubled in the old pain, my own eyes wide as coins looking back at me, nearly convincing. We packed. We left. The chateau stayed, and if it had a voice it didn't use it on us. Sometimes at night, when I turn off the last light in a quiet house, and the refrigerator finds a new way to tick, I think about that red curtain shivering a little in a room no one lived in anymore, and the way the eyes closed once, not in threat or in welcome, but in recognition, like someone at a window remembering your name. My father picked the spot at the very end of the trail, the place where the gravel petered into needles and the trees knit together like a curtain. He said it would be quiet there, no hikers trudging past at dawn, just our fire and our little circle of light and the cold creek talking to itself. He was right. By the second night the forest felt like a room we knew how to live in. The way the smoke found everyone in turn, the click of beetles in the grass, the tarp sighing when the wind leaned on it. He let us stay up late, later than late, telling the kind of stories that only get told when faces are lit from below and you can't tell if someone's smiling or not. It was past midnight when the figure came up the trail. At first, the motion was just a bobbing glow between trunks, then the whir of rubber over dirt, and we relaxed because who else would be out there but a ranger doing the last rounds? The bike scraped, slowed, and a man coasted into the lip of our light, foot dragging to a stop. He swung one leg off and stood there, swaying. He wasn't wearing a ranger's uniform. He wasn't wearing much that made sense, an army coat too big for his narrow frame, a hat with the brim sweat dark and slung over his back, careless as a jacket, a rifle that caught the firelight and drew a thin orange line along the barrel. "Evenin'," he said, and the word broke into pieces in his mouth. Whiskey walked out ahead of his breath. His eyes were bright and wet, the kind of bright that comes from somewhere angry. He looked around at our tent, our cooler, the shoes we had lined up like good soldiers, and then his stare snagged on the fire like it had insulted him. My dad stood. Not fast, not dramatic. just on his feet in that way that says the part of the night where kids are in charge is over. "You lost, friend?" he asked, gentle, the same voice he used when a dog wandered into our yard at home with someone else's tag. He kept his hands where the man could see them, palms empty and open, firelight making valleys out of the veins. "This is my spot," the man said. He swayed once, corrected, then planted his feet wide like he'd remembered a rule about balance. "I stay here. Every night. That's my ring," he added, nodding at the stones around the flames as if we'd stolen his wedding. The silence changed. It pulled tight, got that high wire to it. Somewhere, a tree let go of a pine cone, and it popped in the duff like a muffled firecracker. We all flinched anyway. My mother slid sideways on the camp chair, just enough to put herself between us and him. "We're just here for the weekend," she said, calm as a bank teller. "We can help you find your site if you want." The man laughed. It was a wet sound, humorless, and he leaned toward the fire as if to warm his hands, but never took his eyes off my father. "Don't need help," he said. "Need you to move." He looked past my dad at me and my brother, and the way his look felt on my skin made something small inside me want to hide under the table like a dog during a thunderstorm. "You hear me?" he said, louder now, the vowels sliding around. "Get out of my spot." "I hear you," my father said. "But it's late. Why don't you head on and sleep it off, and in the morning we'll call the ranger and sort this out." He was still talking softly, but his shoulders had changed, said in that military way that says whatever happens next, he'll meet it standing up. The man's right hand, the one closest to the rifle strap, twitched. He didn't grab it. It was barely a thought of a movement, a ghost of a reach, but the sight of his fingers grazing the worn leather was like a pin dropped into a water glass, tiny, unmistakable. The metal along the barrel gleamed. He smiled, or his mouth opened in a way that showed teeth, and his tongue ran over a cracked lower lip. "You think I won't?" he began. The world stopped talking. The night insects went off like a switch. Even the fire took a breath and held it. My father's face did not change. It smoothed, like a lake smoothing after a skipped stone. For a full heartbeat nobody moved, man, rifle, father, fire, all in the same picture, and then everything happened at once. My dad reached into the flames with his bare hand. Later, I would try to remember it as a trick, some angle where the log wasn't actually burning on the side he grabbed, but I can still smell it. The sour, animal stink of singed hair, the clean, bright stink of sap boiling. He didn't snatch. He took hold the way you take hold of a tool, and the log came up trailing a short mane of sparks. He threw it low and hard, and it struck the man in the shin with a thud that was more wood than fire. The drunk stumbled, hollered, hands going to the pain instead of the weapon, and in that narrow window my father crossed the space between them in 2 strides and tackled him. They went down in a tangle, the rifle clattering and spinning out of reach. My mother was already moving, grabbing our wrists, her voice a thin wire thread that tied us to her, saying run, run, run in a tone that didn't belong to any other part of her life. The man on the ground screamed something that tore itself up halfway out, rage and surprise and booze all mixed. My dad said nothing. His face, when I saw it again in a strobing flash of firelight, was grim and empty of everything but purpose. We ran. The trail that had taken all afternoon to find became a straight line under our feet. The woods turned their faces away and let us pass. I expected gunshots, expected that metallic punctuation to chase us through the pines, but the only sounds were our breathing and the brush slapping at our legs and my mother speaking in a voice I'd never heard before. The voice that says I will grow claws if I have to. The ranger station was a box of light in the trees, fluorescent and unreal. They were already looking for him, they said, as if that were some sort of comfort. We blurted over each other, red-faced and shaking, trying to describe a man and a gun and a father who hadn't arrived yet. 2 rangers moved with the precise speed of people who have done this part before, radios clipped to shoulders ticking out codes that sounded like math. Another ranger, a woman with her hair in a harsh, practical ponytail, looked us in the eyes one by one and said we'd done right. They found our campsite a few minutes later. The rifle in the dirt, the drunk cursing about his leg and his spot and his rights, my father kneeling on his back with the ease of a man who'd wrestled brothers and sons and occasionally his own temper. They brought him in for questions, not the drunk, my dad, and his hands were purpled along the knuckles by morning, but the palms were fine, just smudged with ash. He said later it was all a matter of grabbing quick, and where the flames were hottest, and he'd gotten lucky. He said a lot of things that made it sound like this was normal. We packed in daylight with that hungover silence that comes after fear, the three of us moving in the careful orbit of a man who had done something we did not yet have a name for. When the ranger returned my dad's license and shook his hand, the two of them shared a look I couldn't read. On the way out, the forest thinned and then let us go, the road curling us back toward the ordinary world. Somewhere far off, from a hollow we'd never walked, a single, flat crack came through the trees. It could have been a branch snapping, or a backfire on the park road, or something else entirely. Nobody spoke. My father's jaw worked once, then settled. By the time the fire had collapsed into a red-lipped grin and the last sparks had climbed, staggered, and gone out, the grove of oaks around my little camp felt like a ring of listening backs. The Zagros night wasn't silent, far from it. It had that layered hush you only hear when you're far from cities. Wind combing the hills, some insect's zipper song in the grass, the intermittent clink of cooling metal from my pot. I lay in the tent counting my own breaths and trying to convince myself I was tired, and at some point I must have fallen into that shallow, slippery sleep where sounds carry like pebbles tossed into a basin. What pulled me up wasn't loud. It was precise. A note, high and clean as a knife drawn gently along glass, and then another that braided into it, and another, until the air outside the tent was wound with music. I've heard shepherds' flutes in recordings, penna-whistles on Celtic playlists, junky panpipes at street fairs. This was none of those. It didn't sound played so much as exhaled by something that had learned to breathe in more than one key at once. The tones slid against each other, not exactly harmonious, but so close to it that the wrongness felt elegant. I waited for a human voice, laughter, a cough, even a footstep, but nothing broke the pattern. The grove listened with me. Curiosity arrived before sense did. I unzipped the tent slowly enough that every tooth was its own small prayer. Moonlight spilled through the mesh, cold as milk. The world outside had been erased and redrawn in silver. My fire was a dim eye. My pack sat like a dozing animal. The embers ticked to themselves. I stood for a long minute, just letting the night lay hands on me. The music wasn't close, somewhere off to my right, beyond the clearing, as if it were perched on the edge of the hill and playing to the emptiness below. I told myself people camp all the time without being murdered by flautists, told myself I'd keep my distance, told myself the story would be better in the retelling if I at least tried to see. Boots, flashlight, a length of branch I convinced myself was just for balance. I left the zipper drawn mostly closed behind me like a half-kept promise. The first steps were easy. The grove was sparse and the ground soft with leaf fall. As I moved, the music swelled and thinned like breath. Within a dozen paces the other night, sounds had dimmed to a suggestion. By 20, even the wind seemed to hesitate. I kept the flashlight pointed at my own boots and the next patch of ground, clicking it off whenever the beam felt intrusive, letting the moon do the work. The melody threaded through the trees, thin as a wire, and I followed it the way you follow a line with your fingertip in the dark. The clearing announced itself with a kind of relief in the air. The trees stepped back and let space happen. The grass in the center lay bent in a ring, the way grass lies where deer bed down. I took 2 steps closer, shut the flashlight off entirely, and let my pupils fill. The music was louder, and with the loudness came a torque in my chest, a pull at the breastbone that felt embarrassingly like longing. It reached in the way a scent can reach, how a bakery will lift your feet without asking permission. I remember thinking dimly that if the notes wanted me, I'd already given them too much. It was on the far side of the clearing, knee-deep in a low stand of berry bushes, head dipping and lifting in a rhythm that didn't quite match the music. In shape, it was deer enough that my first thought was deer. My second thought was that something was wrong with the rack, and my third thought was not a thought at all but the body knowledge that I should not breathe too loudly. The antler wasn't a branched crown but a single long spiral, matte and pale as old bone, rising and then curling forward like a question. And along that spiral, at irregular intervals, were openings, holes, some the size of a thumb, some no bigger than a lentil. The wind that moved through the clearing moved through those holes and made the notes. I could feel the sound in my teeth. It lifted its head from the berries and turned. That's when I realized how long its face was, the skull showing through the hide at the ridges, the muzzle wet not with berry juice but with something darker that had dried in bristled streaks. Its eyes were wrong. Not luminous like an animal's eyes in light, not glass, but too wet and too focused, the way a person's eyes are when they're deciding between 2 bad choices. When it looked at me, the song tugged an inch deeper into my chest, and it smiled. I mean that. The corners of its long mouth drew back just enough to show a sliver of teeth that were too even for an herbivore and too many for comfort. Movement caught at the edges of the clearing. I hadn't been alone here for a while. Heads were appearing between stems and over grass tops, as if the plants themselves had decided to grow eyes. A pair of striped hyenas, gaunt flanks twitching with alertness. A Persian fallow deer stepping like a dreamer. Rabbits, ears pricked straight as knives. A snake unwinding itself from a coil with theatrical slowness. A cow, of all things dull-eyed and cautious, its bell-less neck making small, undecided motions. They came in ones and twos until the ring was complete, all facing inward, all listening with their whole bodies the way I was. A breeze rose, small and purposeful. It found the holes in the horn, and the song spun tighter, went from breath to blade. The first scream came from something small, one of the rabbits, I think, its body lifting as a fox or a hyena's jaws closed over its spine with a noise like celery breaking. Then the clearing erupted. Harmony collapsed into frenzy. The cow bellowed and drove forward, hornless head swinging, and took the fallow deer in the ribs so hard there was a sound like a door kicked off its hinge. The snake struck at the hind leg of a hyena and hung there, dragged as the dog thing spun and snapped until it had the serpent's middle in its teeth and shook, tearing it in a ragged ribbon that slapped the grass. One rabbit disappeared under a tangle of gray bodies. When they separated, there was nothing left of it but a red seed. I had a moment to register that the deer's eye had gone, gouged by something's claws, left shining and horrible on the grass like a bead, and then the cow's hoof came down on a skull and made a wet, flat sound that will never leave my head. The music stitched through it all, brighter now, quicker, as if the wind had learned the trick of playing more holes at once. With every new gout of sound my body wanted to join. I don't mean run in and gore and bite, I mean move. My legs twitched toward the center. My hands tightened on the branch and imagined it a better weapon than it was. For a second, an honest second, I could see myself charging, not to help anything, not to stop anything, but to be part of the doing. It would have been a relief to stop being a person and be teeth. I don't know what saved me. Cowardice, maybe. The sudden thought of my mother's face. The shock of realizing I was halfway to raising the branch. I wrenched my gaze to the ground and took a step back so hard my heel dug a trench. I pressed the back of my skull against a tree trunk and tried to breathe against the notes. The bark was real. The bark was here. The bark did not sing. I said it like a litany. When it was over all at once. Two animals remained, both heaving. The cow stood with its left eye clouded and leaking, pink threads stringing from the socket like wet cobweb. The hyena faced it, one ear torn into a flag, its breath coming in a high, fast whistle like a kettle about to boil. The wind softened. The horn released one last braid of tones that felt, absurdly, like a lullaby, and both animals' heads jerked as if struck with invisible pebbles. They backed away, confused, as if waking in a room they hadn't chosen. The thing stepped into the center of the clearing, each hoof placed exact. Its spiral lowered a fraction, as if in acknowledgement. It did not look at me again. It did not need to. It set its mouth to the first carcass with the efficiency of a butcher and tore. The sounds were simple and ugly. Skin peeling from muscle, joints surrendering with a pop, the crisp crackle when teeth find cartilage, the wet snap when they find something more stubborn. It fed with a human steadiness, no waste, no ceremony. When it lifted its head for the first time, its muzzle was lacquered in red, and its smile had widened. In the dark slick of its mouth, I could see teeth meant for grass that had been recruited for other work long ago. My stomach came up without asking what I thought about it. I turned my head and put my hands on my knees and gave the night everything I had. The bile burned and the veins stood up in my face, and when the noise of me finally wound down to shivers, the clearing was empty. I don't mean the bodies were gone. They were there, this wasn't a magic show, but the thing had stepped away, as silently as it had existed, and the ring of flattened grass was only a ring of flattened grass again. On my way back, the music followed me low and thin, just a filament of sound that could have been wind through reeds, could have been my own blood in my ears. Twice I stopped because I thought it was behind me, and both times it slid forward, as if I were walking through it. When I crawled into the tent, my hands wouldn't work on the zipper, and my breath had forgotten how to be quiet. I lay on my side and listened to my pulse and the last ghost of notes vibrating in the mesh. It faded by degrees. When silence finally owned the grove again, it wasn't friendly. Dawn came mean and bright. I packed fast and wrong, straps twisted, stove still dirty, the way you do when leaving is more important than how you leave. Hours later, at a roadside pull-off with signal, I searched for names for the thing and found old words that didn't make it less real. That night, in a cheap room with a fan that clicked and wouldn't stop, I fell asleep and woke sick, and for a few seconds, before the world arranged itself into walls and furniture, I heard it again, the faintest braid of tones rising like breath behind me, and in that music was a shape of a smile I will never mistake for kindness. The year my aunt died, the ground went out from under me in slow motion. She was the last person who kept the bills at bay, and when the tumor took her, it left behind a stack of envelopes with red letters and a house that wasn't ours anymore. I sold what could be carried and gave up what couldn't. With the money left, I bought a tent, a cheap sleeping bag, and a flashlight that clicked like a toy gun. I set up in a strip of trees on the outskirts of the city, close enough to catch a bus, far enough that if you didn't know the deer path you'd think there was nothing but scrub and bramble. I got a job waitressing at a strip club because they didn't ask questions and they had showers. I can still remember how the hot water felt the first night, like being handed back a name. That night I stayed late, wiping tables while the DJ played the same 3 songs he always played after last call. I didn't drink. I didn't flirt for tips. I counted the cash twice and thought in numbers. What a week of rent might be, how many showers a roll of quarters could buy, how long it would take to not sleep with one ear open. A man had been watching from the bar, swiveling on his stool to follow me. Nothing dramatic, just those little motions that say you're already a plan in someone else's head. When I clocked out, he was magically near the door. "You're beautiful," he said, like he'd bought the words wholesale. He smelled like cologne covering something sour. I told him my husband was due any minute, that I was late, that he should have a good night. He smiled without moving his eyes. "Let me walk you," he said. I said no and turned left instead of right, into a brighter street that did not lead home. He followed. Soft shoes. Not stumbling, not loud, just there. The sound of him was on my back like a warm hand, and I wanted to peel it off. I kept my shoulders easy and my pace steady. "I just want to talk," he said once. "I know a place." I said nothing. The lie about a husband felt like an open umbrella over my head, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. At the edge of the park, the sodium lights gave up, and the path turned to packed dirt. I cut across to the bus stop, then down into the brush, then back to the path, a childish zigzag meant to shake him without letting him see me commit to the trees. He laughed once, not because anything was funny. "You think I don't know where you're going?" he said, and that line sat in my throat like a swallowed coin. Somewhere behind me his footfalls broke into a run. I didn't turn. My legs did what legs do when the oldest part of your brain tugs the cord. I ran for the one thing I owned. Branches flicked against my jeans and snagged and tore. The flashlight clicked in my hand and I killed it, because light is a flag. I knew the path in the dark by bruise and habit. I slid on a patch of needles and went down on a knee hard enough to see sparks, and kept going with my breath making a saw noise I couldn't quiet. The brush parted in a way my body recognized, and I was at the little clearing, my tent a low dark animal hunched between 2 birches. I dove, zipped, and lay flat with the sleeping bag over me like a smothering promise. I turned the flashlight in my fist, so the lens pressed into my palm, and the cheap plastic seam bit my knuckles. I tried to quiet my breathing, and each inhale was a flare I couldn't stamp out. The city's far noise runs like a river out there, a dull constant. It had become a blanket for me, a sound to sleep under. That night it went thin, like the blanket had been pulled back and something colder had settled in. Footsteps and leaves sound like words you can almost make out. He didn't bother to hide them. Slow, deliberate, letting me hear inventory. Here I am, here I am. They circled once, wide, a methodical scan of the clearing. I shut my eyes even though there was nothing to see, and counted 1, 2, 3 with my tongue pressed to the roof of my mouth, so the numbers couldn't leak out and betray me. The steps came close. Close enough that I could feel the ground register each footfall through the thin foam under my shoulder blade. Something brushed the tent fabric near my knees, a soft stroke, testing. The nylon puckered and rasped and made the smallest zip noise. I stopped breathing. I didn't decide to. My body just forgot. He stood at my head. I know because I could hear him breathe. Not just air in and out, but the shape of his mouth around it, a little whistle on the exhale as if one nostril had a kink. His shadow draped the tent wall and erased the faint city glow without being a shape I could name. He leaned. The fabric dimpled until it touched my hair, and the tiny static crackle of nylon made every nerve I owned sit up and look. I could smell him now, stale sweat, and something chemical like old cleaners stuck in clothes. My eyes watered, and I let them because crying is quieter when you don't fight it. The flashlight in my hand slicked with sweat and wanted to slip, and I clenched it so hard my fingers prickled. If he unzipped, if the little metal tab ticked, I told myself I would scream and swing, and the scream felt like something that might not belong to me in time. He whispered my stage name, the one I never used off the clock, right against the fabric. Hearing it come from the wrong side of the nylon made my stomach turn over. He whispered it again and then said, soft and pleased, "Found you." The tent wall stayed still. The zipper didn't move. His breath went in and out, as if we were practicing together. Time got stretchy. He shifted weight once and a twig popped. The crickets in the brush started up again in a little tentative choir and then shut off like a switch. Somewhere above us, a plane dragged a thin roar across the sky that felt like a message from another planet. My arms began to shake from holding still. I swallowed, and the sound of it in my own ears was so loud I was sure he'd hear it. "Good girl," he breathed, not like praise, like filing. Eventually, minutes or hours, the breathing moved. The steps went away from my head, to the side, around again, slower, and then paused by the door. I felt the zipper tab through the nylon like a bead under fabric. It jingled, the faintest, and then didn't. Paper made a dry little sound, a stiff corner against the ground. He stood there long enough that my scalp prickled. Then his feet eased back into the leaves, and the leaves swallowed him. I didn't move. I lay there and let the night finish around me. When I slept, it was the kind of sleep you fall into because your body throws the switch to save itself. At gray light, the birds began their petty arguments. That was my permission. I unzipped carefully, like defusing, and slipped out of the tent into an air that smelled like wet soil and the metal aftertaste of fear. Nothing looked wrong. The birches were birches, my little fire ring-a-ring. But the ground tells on you if you listen. My shoeprints from the night before were a dotted line from the path to my tent, a shallow pattern stamped in dust and dew. Overlapping them, neater, bigger, a different tread had followed. He hadn't stumbled into me. He had tracked me here, right foot a hair turned in, as precise as reading. The print stopped at my door and spread a little, the way a stance spreads when someone plants and leans. The paper lay where he'd put it, a club flyer with a girl in a sequined bikini, smiling with all her teeth. On the back, in block letters too careful for the message they carried, red ink said, "Be here tomorrow, and I'll kill you." The ink had bled in one corner into my fingerprint when I picked it up, so that a red thumb smudge sat there like a bad signature. I flipped it back, and the girl kept smiling with her harmless teeth. I broke camp in 12 minutes. I left the tent stakes I couldn't pry up with my hands. I walked out carrying things I should have thrown away because throwing away meant bending and turning my back. The bus driver didn't look at me, and I was grateful. At the club, I showered so hot it hurt, and then I told Tasha everything. She stared, then swore pretty and long, and said, "You're coming with me." I did. One night, then a week, then a year on her couch. I got steady, then a room, then a door with a lock that was mine. Every now and then in a grocery store or a dim bar, I hear a little whistle on an exhale, and my hand closes around the handle of my cart like a flashlight. I kept the flyer for a long time, until the red turned brown. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself that I left because I chose to, not because he told me to. Maybe because some nights, on the edge of sleep, I can still feel nylon kiss my hair where a fingertip pressed, and I need to hold the paper and watch my own thumbprint bloom and think, I found me first. We trusted the GPS because it had gotten us to the cabin, and because it spoke with the cheerful certainty of a kindergarten teacher. It didn't matter that it was old enough to have a cigarette lighter plug, or that the map display looked like a Game Boy game. When it told us to take a left, we took a left. We'd burned a pizza on the grill, laughed it off, packed the car, and now wanted the fast way back to the main road. The sky had done that summer thing where it stayed blue forever, and then suddenly remembered it was night. The trees slipped closer to the road like they were eavesdropping. Left in 50 meters, the GPS said in its bright little voice. The road it meant was no road, just a panel of dirt slipping between two sagging fence posts. Looks private, my friend said, but I was already turning, because the arrow said turn, and the arrow had never been wrong. We bumped over ruts and into a tunnel of trees. The car's headlights found leaves and gave them a brief stage career before moving on. The GPS told us to continue for 1 mile. It felt like we had driven a mile by the time we hit the first hanging thing. Not with the car, God no, but with the light. It swung out of the dark into the high beam, limp as a drowned hand, and for a second my brain made it a person. Then glass eyes flashed, and the thing spun once, twice, face jerking into a grin and out of it, grin and out, as if practicing expressions. A doll. A big one, the size of a toddler, wearing a dress that used to be white and now was the color of dishwater. It turned in the breath of wind we brought with us, and ticked on its wire. "What the?" my friend said, voice climbing. I eased off the gas. The headlights reached farther and found more. Dozens, maybe 100. Dolls hung from the trees on both sides of the lane, every branch an armory of them. Some had their hair matted into spikes, mildew knitting it together. Some had no hair at all, scalp painted in pale pink grin. A few were nailed to trunks, arms splayed, as if mid-jumping jack. One had its head wired backward, so it stared over its own shoulder. A clown's face, sun-bleached into a cracked pastel, gazed down with a smile that had bubbled and reset like melted sugar. Bodiless heads swung on strings. Their mouths were stuck open in a perfect O that made me want to put my fist in there just to stop it. The car crept, and every small movement in the grove became a life, eyes catching light, limbs jerking lazily. I could smell them through the vents, a damp plastic sweetness, like the inside of an old Tupperware left wet too long, threaded with something sour, rodent musk, maybe, or the breath of old cloth. The wind made the dolls talk. Not words, but a chorus of quiet creaks and near squeaks where rusted joints moved against wire, where string burned a groove in a limb. One head turned all the way around with a tiny sound like a cork coming free. Somewhere deeper in, something thumped as if a heavier doll had slipped its knot and kissed the ground with its hollow skull. "This is somebody's," my friend began, and then the word yard failed and hung there like a fourth doll on our sentence. The lane widened just enough for a house to happen at the end of it, a low farmhouse slouched over a porch. The paint had given up at least 2 owners ago. A single upstairs window caught our light and threw it back weakly. The GPS chimed, arrived. Then, as if reconsidering, it recalculated and instructed us to proceed straight ahead, which would have meant driving into the house. "Nope," I said. The word came out too loud, like a voice trying to break ice. I stopped the car. The dolls made their small noises around us. We sat, headlights carving a bright tunnel through the hanging faces, and the house sat at the end of it and did nothing. I put the car in reverse. Something tapped the rear windshield. Not a bang, not a knock. A tap, like a fingernail testing a melon. I flinched so hard my teeth tapped, too. "Bird," my friend said, immediately, helpfully, stupidly, because you have to give yourself a story to stand on. I let the car roll back carefully, the tires hissing in the soft dirt. On my side, a doll scraped its little shoes along the glass as it swung. The squeak of rubber on window almost made me cry. The trees closed in the way eyes close when someone faints. There was very little room to spare. In the high beam's hard light, I could see the wire bites in the bark where someone had cinched the dolls into place and left them to weather. Some of the wires had rusted and bled orange down the trunks like tears. A headless torso, baby-soft vinyl caving at the shoulders, rotated and clocked its hard neck stump against another doll's porcelain cheek. The cheek cracked with a sound like ice. The head fell, bounced once in the dust, and stopped face up. It had both eyes, but both had been painted half shut by sun, so it gazed at us through sleepy lids as if bored by our fear. "Faster," my friend said. "Trees," I said, because if I went too fast, the car would throw one of those dangling things into our open windows, and then I would drive into a tree, and that would be the end of the story because there wouldn't be an end. We inched. The dolls ticked and whispered. I became aware of another sound under them, a gentle, intermittent scrape like fabric moving against wood. At the house, in the upstairs window, something shifted in the curtain. Not a big movement. A ripple. Enough that the fabric bulged once and smoothed, like a hand had touched it and left. My foot came off the brake and onto the gas too hard, and the car lurched and a clown swung into the path of the light, its painted eye-catching beam so perfectly that the pupil became a pinpoint star. For a second, it looked alive with intention. Then it rushed back into shadow. The lane didn't let us go so much as we escaped it inch by inch. My friend had her phone out, thumb on the emergency number like it was a rosary bead. I kept my hands forward and white on the wheel, and my world narrowed to the left mirror, the right mirror, the line of dolls in front of us, the grinding complaint of the car crawling backward over ruts. When we finally reached the sagging fence posts, I nearly tore the steering wheel off, turning us onto the main road. The sudden emptiness of treeless space around the car felt obscene. We didn't talk for a mile. The GPS recovered its composure and offered us a different route, cheerier than ever. My friend said finally, "Did you see the curtain?" I said because if I said the word hand, I would have to pull over and stop and never drive again. Back at the highway, with other people's taillights in front of us like little red saints, the world climbed back into its ordinary clothes. We agreed, without agreeing, not to tell anyone because who wants to be the kind of people who go looking for that house later with a group and some beer and flashlights and bravado and end up on the news? But sometimes I wake at that hour that belongs to ghosts and insomniacs, and I can hear it again, the not quite sound of string on plastic, the way things creak when they're held in place and want one more inch. I think of a collection that started with one doll and grew until the trees were full, until a person could walk between them and make choices, rearrange, nail, wire, prune. I think of that curtain's small, satisfied ripple, and I wonder if the dolls keep the house company, or if the house keeps the dolls fed. We were supposed to pick a site close to campus like everyone else, 200 meters up the path from the gate, sketch a few trees, call the slope gentle, and get coffee. But the hills behind the university kept tilting their green chins at us, daring, so we shouldered our tubes of trace paper like spears and went higher. The air thinned into that clean, eucalyptus bitter smell. The dust on the path was the color of cinnamon, and every time the wind came through the leaves, it carried a cool, damp breath from someplace higher we hadn't earned yet. We talked a lot at first, argued about angles, about whose concept model was secretly ugly, and then the grades stole our oxygen, and we shut up. Birds did the talking for us, sharp little whistles and metallic calls that rang off stone. We heard the other sound before we saw the clearing. It didn't belong to birds or wind or boots. A wet thud, then a pause. Another. A rhythmic labor, as if the mountain had grown a heartbeat too large for its chest. We cocked our heads like a pack of dogs. "Drum," someone offered, and then we all knew it wasn't a drum because drums don't make the second sound, the sticky, sucking noise that comes after the strike, as if something has to let go. We came around a bend and the trees loosened, and there they were, 3 figures in the long grass, standing in a loose triangle around a duffel bag. A cheap black one, gym-sized, the zipper crooked like a mouth with silver teeth. It had burst along one seam, and what was inside had slumped out in a dark, glistening slope. One of the men raised his machete and brought it down with the same shoulder movement you use to split firewood. The blade met something soft and dense, and the sound it made was a syllable you don't hear in polite places. The second man flicked his blade to shed what clung to it. A red thread jumped from steel to grass and spattered a fern. The third man pressed the bag with his boot as if to keep it from writhing, and the zipper teeth smiled wider. A hand slid into view, limp and not attached to anything the way hands like to be. It was small, knuckles nicked, nails bitten down to stubborn moons. It lay palm up on the grass like an answer to the wrong question. I didn't know then that I would carry that image for the rest of my life. The way the lines in that palm took the light, how ordinary they were, how you could almost read them. We didn't shout or gasp or do anything theatrical. We simply stopped making noise, and the world noticed. A branch under someone's heel betrayed us with a crisp crack. The men didn't flinch. They just stopped. 3 machetes froze midair. 3 heads turned in the same patient arc until their faces found us in the trees. I could tell you what they wore. One had a red baseball cap turned backward. Another wore a jacket too warm for the day, stained along the cuffs. The third had a kerchief tied at his throat and a tattoo arrow disappearing under it. But what I remember most are their eyes, flat, appraising, not angry yet, the way you'd look at a stray dog you haven't decided to kick or feed. The one in the cap lifted his chin. He made a sound I thought at first was a bird. 2 notes, quick, with a fall between them. The second man answered with a higher pair. The third smiled without showing teeth. "Run," Louisa said, not loud, not dramatic, just a small push of air that flipped our switch. We ran. The path immediately multiplied. Every animal track and rain gully offered itself as an exit. The eucalyptus shed strips of bark that moved underfoot like snakes and made fools of our ankles. My blueprint tube knocked the back of my knee with every stride, and I wanted to throw it into the brush, but the part of me that still believed in grades kept it. The city dropped away behind us. The murmur of traffic traded for our breath and the smack of leaves on our arms. The whistle came again, from the left now, the same 2 notes, then an answer ahead. They weren't shouting. They were placing us. We took a sharp right where the trail split around a boulder tattooed with old graffiti. 10 minutes later, lungs burning, we hit the same boulder. The same faded letters. The same cigarette melt in the stone. The path had looped like a trick rope and set us down exactly where we didn't want to be. No, 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 Andres said, voice fraying, as if the mountain could be argued with. The canopy changed, briefly, to a stand of guadua, tall green poles rattling like bones when the wind found them. The ground under them was slick with their leaves, ovals like coins. I heard the whistle again and realized it wasn't always the same two notes. Sometimes the first was stretched, sometimes the second flicked short, a little language shifting to say here, there, now. Luisa tripped and slid and left a smear of mud and blood on a smooth rock where her palm caught. I grabbed her by the elbow and we ran bent double for a while, like we were apologizing to the air. The trail tilted into a gully and then into a shallow creek, water clear as glass and fast enough to make the stones roil under it. We waded through shin deep and the cold went into my bones like a reprimand. On the far bank, the path broke into 5 shy paths, all equally promising, all equally wrong. We chose the one with the most footprints because panic is democratic. The eucalypt scent gave way to wet stone and something copper-sweet on the wind, as if the mountain remembered other bags and other afternoons. The whistles drifted and doubled. Once they came from behind and ahead at the same time, once from below us, which didn't make sense until we realized the ridge curved and sound does what it wants up there. We stopped to listen and every small thing became a threat. The chitter of a bird, the clack of bamboo, the steep quiet that means someone has decided to breathe through their mouth. We should go down, Andres said. Down always goes back to the city. Unless it goes to the river, Luisa said, and we all pictured the river as a long, brown eraser. Our map was a printout, smudged and soft with the grease of lunches. It didn't show the way panic opens new trails. It didn't show the part where we turned to check behind us, and the brush looked like a crowd of men not moving. I counted to 30 to steady my hands, and when I got to 15 the whistle cut across the numbers, and my mouth forgot what came next. The light thinned the way it does at altitude, gray leaking into green. My calves trembled from the downhill. Something white snagged on a thorn at the edge of the path, a strip of plastic zipper tape, teeth still set in it, smiling. Luisa made a sound I've never heard her make before or since. We didn't pick it up. We didn't need to hold proof. We chose a trail and it was wrong. We chose another and it returned us to a rock we'd already memorized. The city's hum never came back. The hill had eaten it. When we finally stopped, because bodies stop, because breath empties and will doesn't fill it fast enough, the forest stood around us with the patience of a crowd waiting for a show to start. The last bird calls died as if a conductor had lowered a hand. From somewhere not far, then farther, then closer again, the two-note signals braided over our heads, tidy as measurements, and I had the sick certainty that the men with the machetes knew these paths the way we knew the studios, by squeak and stain and where the light falls. We were lost, and the mountain knew it, and the whistles kept count. We were the slackers and smokers, the kids who signed up for canoe trips because the counselors in charge of canoe trips were the kind of people who didn't inventory your pockets. It was the 80s, a time when camp felt like a country with its own laws, and our island on the big clear lake felt like a little breakaway state, pines, a sandy rim, a running trail wide enough for a four-wheeler, and a fire ring we built up like a crown. The first night, when the sun slid behind the black line of trees and left us with a lid of stars, we did what kids do. We fed the fire and told lies. Someone produced warm beer. Someone else produced mushrooms I didn't take. The smoke climbed straight up for a while, and then learned our names. The wind shifted and threw a fistful of smoke in my face, the kind of thick, lung-sticking cloud that tastes like old newsprint. I coughed hard enough to see sparks. Say it, one of the older guys grinned. At this camp we had a superstition as casual as a handshake. When the smoke finds you, you say, "I hate white rabbits," and it slinks away to bother someone else. Nobody knew where it came from. Somebody said it was a voodoo thing. Somebody else said it was from a book. Mostly we liked how it worked. I said it, because why not, and the smoke peeled off me like a cat changing laps. Then it went to Jess, who said it faster, laughing. Then to Mike, who shouted it like a dare. Around the ring the smoke moved, each of us batting it away with the words like a lazy ball in a game none of us wanted to be the first to quit. The cadence picked up. I hate white rabbits. I hate white rabbits. I hate white rabbits. Voices overlapping, boys trying on menace like a jacket in a mirror. The mushrooms made someone giggle at the wrong time, and the giggle braided into the chant until it wasn't funny anymore, just a high thread in a rope pulling tighter. The fire obliged. The column of smoke stopped wandering and began to spin, slow at first, and then with a discipline that didn't feel like air. It drew itself narrow over the flames, as if it were remembering a shape. The pine needles beyond the ring stirred, and then laid flat, all their points facing in, as if we were at the center of a magnetic field we'd built by accident. "Okay," the counselor said, not okay at all. But nobody wanted to break. The chant leaned into itself. The smoke took on a texture, strips in a tight helix, a gray screw rising. Sparks climbed, got caught in the spiral, and raced up like eyes. I could feel the hair on my arms trying to stand despite the sweat. On the far side of the fire, Jess's face had gone pale and mean at once. A pop from the logs made us all flinch, and then laugh too loud, the kind of laugh that hopes to outrun a feeling. When we finally ran out of breath and sense, the last white rabbits came out frayed. The vortex loosened and drifted toward the dark. Someone kicked dirt into the ring, and someone else said we were idiots, and we agreed and didn't. We played it sleeping. The island was bothered all night by small noises, water lipping the shore, something trotting the trail, the faint metallic click of a pot settling on its rock. I was the one who opened the tent at dawn. A lake morning in the Adirondacks is a soft, milky thing, the kind of light that makes you believe in second chances. The air smelled of wet ash and pine syrup. When I stepped out barefoot, my toes sank into the cool sand of the trail. And there it was, spanning the width like a bar laid across a door, a rabbit. It was too big. That's the first wrong thing. Not big like a hare, big like a dog, except wrong everywhere a dog is right. The fur was white the way bones are white, blue-veined, too clean where it wasn't dirty. Its eyes were glazed an unreal blue, the cataract color of marbles. They stared at nothing with the full attention of the dead. The mouth hung open, not slack but pride, the jaw unhinged and torqued so you could see the yellow rail of teeth and the stringy pink where something had tugged hard. Its ears were torn. One lay folded under its head like a ribbon. Flies had found it early and were already busy, a low silver cloud that rose and settled in waves. The air above it was warmer by a degree and smelled like pennies in a camp mug. "Jesus," Jess said behind me, voice small for once. We stood there like we'd woken a god by accident. The trail around it wore marks I don't have explanations for. The sand was scorched in thin crescents, faint charcoal smears that made a broken circle around the carcass, as if someone had drawn and redrawn a shape in the dark with a coal from our fire. In 2 places, the needles had been pressed down in tidy arcs, like kneeling. No one claimed it. No one touched it. We said practical things to each other. Coyotes, maybe, or a fisher, or a dog from a boat, and kept saying them until the words had no edges. The counselor looked at the sky and announced breakfast like the sky had offered it. We stepped around the rabbit as wide as the trail allowed, each of us holding some part of our bodies away, as if we were a magnet and it was a nail. By 10 the sun had lifted in it, and the flies were committed. By 11 the smell snagged at the back of your throat unless you faced the water. Around noon, when someone finally said we should drag it into the brush or bury it, we went back to the trail with a found branch and a plan to be braver together. It was gone. Not gone like a dream. Gone like a chore someone else had done. In its place the sand was torn with parallel grooves, messy at first and then cleaner, like something heavy had been dragged and then found its rhythm. The grooves led into the trees, and then into shade, and then into that part of the island where tracks become guesswork. Between the first 2 pines the drag marks paused and fanned, and in that fan were prints you could read if you wanted to read them. Small front feet, large hinds, close together, as if whatever had taken the rabbit had also been a rabbit once, only more. On one trunk, knee-height, for vertical scratches raked sap that gleamed like amber tears. We didn't follow. We said we didn't because of time, because of breakfast, because of boats. But the truth had more to do with the way the fire ring looked that afternoon, as if the stones had shifted a little in their sleep and were pretending innocence. That night nobody said the words. The smoke found our faces, and we took it like penance. The lake was glass. The stars came heavy and low. Somewhere on the running trail a thing moved without moving brush, and if it stopped in the dark and listened, it did it with ears we'd torn and teeth we'd admired by accident. In the morning there was nothing on the path but sand and needles, and a circle no one had drawn. I didn't believe in curses then. I don't now. But sometimes I wake with a taste of ash and metal at the back of my tongue, and the memory of smoke that knew how to climb itself into a shape. And I think maybe not believing is just another kind of chant. We got lost before we even started. The map said there was a parking lot that didn't exist, a neat little square at the end of a road that became more ruts than road. So we looped around the mountain and finally found a real lot at the top, gravel, a pit toilet, a bulletin board with sun-faded notices. It was late but not dark yet, high blue caught in the branches. We planned to drop down a few miles, camp, climb back up in the morning. It felt simple in my head, walk, sleep, walk. About an hour in the trail stopped matching the printout we'd scavenged online. Blazes were half peeled, fallen trees made detours that looked like choices, and the map in my hand was getting soft with sweat. We came around a bend and there he was, sitting just off the path like he'd grown there. Thin, a little too still, a cheap camp stove making a faint jet engine hiss at his shins. He smiled too wide before his eyes decided to join in, and then they didn't blink. "You folks know where you're at?" he asked, voice cracking on the last word as if it had gotten dusty on the shelf. He wanted directions to a place on the mountain, he said. He'd been dropped at point A and needed to get to point B. 10 seconds later, he corrected himself. He'd parked at point B and his friend was at point C. Another friend had the map and had turned back. The story rearranged itself while he told it, pieces sliding around, and every time we tried to fix one in our heads another piece jumped the rail. He edged a little closer onto the trail. The smile stayed, showing too much gum. "You camping?" he said. "Me too. Good night for it. I've got stuff." He tapped the pocket of his jacket with 2 fingers in a way that made me think of pill bottles. We wished him luck and kept moving, the polite, brisk kind that's really a retreat. The woods closed over him. I could feel his stare between my shoulder blades like an insect. We walked into a section where the trail became a horse path lined in barbed wire, no camping signs hammered crooked into posts, the kind of place where you tell yourself the no is about horses and not about you. Then the path sank into a long puddle that ate the whole width, and I could see my face in it, pale and pinched. We decided to go back to the last clear junction and try another line. 20 feet behind us, footsteps. Not even trying to be quiet. We turned and he was there, close enough that I could see the chewed edge of his lower lip. He said hey like we were friends who'd just run into each other at a grocery store aisle. Then, casually, like you'd mentioned bug spray, said, "You guys need anything?" "I got fentanyl and one other. Helps with the climb." He patted the same pocket. The smile didn't move. His eyes were still wrong, wet and wide, no blink, as if he didn't want to miss our reaction. All the little red flags in my head stood up and started clattering. My boyfriend said, "Light, too light. We're good." And we turned away. I could feel him behind us, the weight of him, the way his shoes found every crisp leaf and made it talk. We didn't run. Not at first. We walked like people who are not afraid. Then the trail steepened and my heart came up into my mouth, and we stopped performing. We climbed fast, past the place where the map had pretended there was a switchback, past the rock with the old graffiti and the bottle cap embedded in the dirt, past the birch that bent over the trail like a broken arm. The sound of him stretched thin behind us, and then thickened again, as if he'd found a shortcut we didn't know. The mountain gulps light in the last hour. It went gray around us, and my breath started to taste like metal. We had water, plenty, but the moving and the panic turned my mouth to cotton. I drank and felt no relief, only the slosh in my gut. When I looked over my shoulder, he wasn't there. That would have been a relief if the footsteps had also stopped. They hadn't. They paced us just out of sight, an occasional crunch off to the side like he was walking parallel, trying angles. Then, from ahead, this is where I think I started to lose the thread. A shadow slid between 2 trees, and I thought it was him, but it was only a stump tilted just so. And then I thought I saw a black shape squat and enormous in the brush, a bear, but it was a boulder with moss-like fur. I could taste something sweet and coppery, and for a minute was convinced I was vomiting blood. It was red Gatorade catching in my throat, but my body didn't care about explanations. We did the miles back uphill in a time that makes no sense to me now. The trail became a tunnel. We didn't talk, we only touched hands once when I stumbled, and my boyfriend pulled me up without looking, like he had new instincts for it. At the last rise the trees thinned, and the gravel of the lot showed like a beach after a long swim. A sign on the bulletin board took the headlights of my headlamp and threw them back. Hitchhikers may be escaped convicts. It had always been there. It felt like the mountain was only now letting us read. I sat down on a bench and let the pack tilt me backward like a punched rag doll. My boyfriend said he'd get the car. The parking lot curves, and as he walked out of sight the blankness around me grew teeth. A minute became 3, became a knot of minutes. Behind me, from the dark mouth of the trail, a single step sounded, just one, close enough to be a statement. I stood because sitting felt like offering a neck, and the world went smaller, narrowed to the rectangle of light my lamp made, and the silhouette of the bulletin board, and my own breathing thumping in my ears. Headlights eased around the curve, and I almost cried at the sight of our car. He pulled up, and I climbed in and locked the door, and only then realized my hands were shaking hard enough to rattle the handle. We rolled past the sign and out onto the road, the forest peeling back, and I let myself sag against the seat like something deflated. As the lot slid behind us, we passed a line of parked cars I hadn't noticed on the way in. On the end, nearest the trail, was a faded sedan with a dented hood and a single window cracked an inch. On the passenger seat sat a cheap camp stove, a map folded into a soft square, and a jacket with a torn pocket. The license plate holder read "Smile" in peeled vinyl. The windshield cut our headlights into 2 white coins and threw them back at us. For a second, in that glare, I thought I saw movement. Someone sitting very still behind the glass, eyes wide open, not blinking, smiling like he had learned to. Then the road took us and the trees closed, and I decided I had imagined it, because deciding that was the only way to keep going.